We're here at Flowers Cork Street to talk to Terry Setch about his exhibition, Reduced to Rubble. You moved to Wales in 1969 and you live on the coast there. How significant was this move to the development of your work?
When I went to the beach, in a glorious setting, the view is fantastic. I needed to establish a way of working, structure, not in terms of painting, but so what I did, I regarded my beach as a playground, and it's where you can do many, many things unseen, and yet, well, not just unseen, you can behave irreverently. You wouldn't behave like that in the street. You can pick up something and throw it into the sea, as all kids do. You can build, which kids do, grown-ups do as well when they go with their children. And so I decided that I would just let it go, and I'd make all sorts of things out of the debris that was around. So I'd make a fire, I'd make something to hang, a billy can or something like that. I'd make a raft. I did all sorts of things like that. But I found when I started to move into the structural principles that I needed to set up, I found 6 lengths of tree stumps, and I set these up in a line to confront the tide, which is a 40-foot tide, the second highest in the world. And I would hang from these totems all manner of things that, seaweed, cans, anything I found. I wasn't really interested in being selective. I would also number them 1 to 6 and that sort of thing. And then the idea was that the tide would come in and displace them, literally knock them down, cover them, and I'd find them somewhere else. So I had a system working, and it enabled me to realize that I could impose any invented system, my own system. You're in nature, so it's got its own systems, tidal and such forth, and my own system on that. I eventually realized that I had to get it from being an installational thing, which could be on the beach and then would disappear. You could do that, there would be no audience. I'd feel quite happy about that. But I think that's what I've always wanted to deal with painting. I felt there was many more miles to go than Pollock. I was a British person. I was steeped in those cultural conventions. I was steeped in Turner and the landscape and so forth. I wanted to find my own way of working. So what I did was to find fabric which I could transport to the beach. Polypropylene was the fabric I chose, which was is an industrial material. For instance, chairs are made of polypropylene and furniture and so forth. This was a flat material and extremely light, and I could fold it, 30 foot of it, and I could fold it and put it on my arm. And I'd go and I'd then lay it on the ground. And the ground's never level, it has all sorts of pits. It has a very stony beach, but full of fossils, dinosaur footprints, a lot, it's all there. Stratification of the cliffs behind, continually falling, alabaster, it's all there. And I could lay that fabric out, and then I'd have to invent what I was going to do. When I'd got things really working, I then would scatter them. I'd take pigment down, they'd get fixed in some kind of marked way, and then I'd take that back home, and then I'd come down again and get all the stuff I found, take it back to the studio. I would have 4 canvas bases on which were about the size of this. I'd lay them on the ground, and then I'd scatter. I'd throw the detritus, scatter in a totally haphazard way, with no reason to be there other than a practical one. That is going to be, that's too high for the edge, it needs to be more to the center, that sort of thing. And then I laid the fabric over the top, and then I would pour my waxes and they would dissolve through the material onto the wax surface, and I get a kind of sandwich of things. And my processes are working with hot air guns, paint strippers. You know, initially it was blow lamps, and that was very dangerous with a flame coming out. But hot air guns, and it would dissolve the waxes, and I continually work it like that and get clusters, and the figuration would come because it's always in my mind. You know, it might be the figuration would emerge. At a certain stage in my development, politics came into it. Initially it wasn't politics, and I realized I was dealing with recycling and pollution. Not that Penarth is any more polluted than anywhere else in the world, and I wasn't really saying Penarth is polluted. I was talking about the big global issues which started to come in about 15 years after I started. And so it developed that way. For instance, the one in the shop window of this gallery, that's very much to do with the Ebola crisis, which is going on in my mind. You know, when we can't escape these things. You know, so things come out. I can't stop them coming out, and I want them to come out, but I've got to have the physical condition for them to emerge.
Martin Holman has described the beach in your work as the Neville Shute-like emblem of civilization's final refuge from nuclear or ecological catastrophe. Do you have these metaphors in mind?
Yeah, I mean the beach is you know, you can imagine constructing a theatrical setup with that in mind. The beach is like that almost. It's so primal, and it's been so smashed by the forces of nature. And it's been attacked by people, as we do things, we move things, you know, we reshape it somehow or other. They do violent things like cars being pushed over the cliff top. It's gone now, all of that, it doesn't happen. But they were at one stage, and you find amazing assemblages. So, for instance, a car would be pushed over and get wedged into the rock. The 40-foot car tide would come in and rip it to pieces. All the light metal would go within a week or so, and you're left with the remains of its carcass.
And then all of these materials end up somehow sort of fossilised in your paintings.
Yeah, fossilised on the beach, because I could take you to a place where 30 years ago where the cars were pushed over, and I could find bits. You wouldn't find them. I could find them because they become encrusted, and they're like the rock itself. But you know, they're still there. But I've got lots in my paintings, my wall hangings over the years.
Can you tell us a bit about the painting that we're standing by? So, what is that by your head there?
Well, the painting is called Reduced to Rubble. So it's as if it's all been rubbed down and worked to a point where it becomes something else, the whole thing. I've always thought from the 70s onwards of how I can extend the surface, because I think surface is an issue that's not talked about enough. I mean, nobody cares about the surface of those paintings of blooms of flowers or whatever. It's got surface, and the artists were interested in surface. I'm interested in surface. But the moment you extend it to beyond the painted surface, it becomes an object. So you'd say, what is that, in a sense? And really, I don't give it a name. It has connotations with other things, for instance, dogs shitting on the beach. But it's not that, you know. It's another object, and if you're given an identity, then that's really the way it works. When things protrude or things are shaped, then you give the meaning starts to revolve around that.
But so that's an object that you created?
Oh yeah. I mean, all this is you know, there are things picked up from the beach like that rope and so forth, but most of it's totally my construct in the studio. Yeah.
And I mean, they really do, your works appeal to all of the senses.
Well, hopefully, you know, I'd like people to go close to them. People never do go that close to pictures. I'd like them to touch it, really, but they don't. and you're not allowed to, you know, that sort of thing. Certainly I'd like close contact with it. And I think they do succeed in that way. People, the comments I've had, you know, people feel the work. It's not just an abstract work, they feel the work. And where does it fit in culturally? Who knows? But it's, in my mind, it fits into a very British way of dealing with the landscape.
And what about the titles? Do they come afterwards?
Yeah, sometimes the tide licks the shore is an evocative, which is the other piece there, is an evocative title. You watch the tide, you watch it just move in, and it just ripples over rocks or rubble or whatever.
So it's very much about bringing basically the seascape to life. And
yeah, yes it is, yeah. Yes, in all of them, it's that. I do little pictures, you know, this sort of size, which are very much more pictorial, and they're in caustic wax, and they're more traditional in a way. That is another way to bring those sensations to people. People get to those much quicker than they can get to larger works, because the larger work is a very physical object. You know, it doesn't have neat edges. It has the edges which the surface gives you, and it imposes itself on you. I love the contrast between an interior wall, a house wall, and rough image, rough surface.
Presumably they look very different hung on the wall here than they do
in my studio. It's so messy, and that this is perhaps the first time I've seen them.
You mentioned that you take the propylene, was it, down to the beach?
Polypropylene.
Do you start making them actually in situ on the beach?
I did. I don't now.
You don't now?
Because I'm 80, and I can't do that. So it's manufactured from memory sources. You know, I've experienced all those things so much that any one of those things, those moments can come into it. For instance, you know, certain funny things like I laid the fabric down on the ground and I started working with blue pigment. I had lots of blue pigment and I scattered all over this fabric. And a dog came along, and this dog, was approaching me, and I thought, I know what dogs do. They want you to play with them. So it got to me. I couldn't see any people. So I picked up a stone and threw it, and it ran away because he picked the stone up. He went right in the middle of the work and put it down. And of course it was then covered in blue pigment. So I thought, shoo. Not too aggressively, because you can't get aggressive with dogs, they might get aggressive back. And the people came along and I said, "It's your dog?" And they said, No, it's not our dog. And so I played around with that dog for about an hour, and then I realised I can't win. So I rolled everything up, pretending to leave, and I walked a long way, and it ran away, and it was about 200 yards in front of me, and off it was going. And the moment I stopped, that dog sensed that I'd stopped, turned around, came running back again. So I put rolled everything up. That was it. I walked about a mile back to the Esplanade, and I got to the Esplanade, and an old woman shouts, "Is this your dog? It's got blue stuff all over it." Most of the work that I do it fails halfway through. Things don't succeed. The pigment I use as well is interesting. Now I hot wax. I get pigment, raw pigment, and the traditional way would be you make a tablet out of colour, out of raw, molten wax. Put it in a little cake thing or whatever. You pour your pigment in, just stir it round, and it solidifies, and you've got a tablet of colour to use. That would be the traditional way, which the Egyptians used in their wax paintings of Roman generals and whatever. To go on to the coffins I use it in a very big way. It's another thing which I seem to invent. I didn't invent encaustic painting because it is a means of painting. It's a technique which Britain didn't have hold on too much, but certainly Jasper Johns, for instance, encaustic painting of beeswax paintings. I knew of those sort of things, those pictures. But microcrystalline wax is somewhat different. It's cruder, but I also found by mixing turpentine with it, in those early days, in the early 70s, I could make a bucketful, and once I found I could make a bucketful, it meant I could find spreaders and means of shaping pictures. I could work large rather than small, because if you put hot wax onto, you just work it one mark at a time. That's the way the Egyptians, you see the paintings in the British Museum, they're just one mark, cross-hatching, and built up like that. But this isn't, there's not much cross-hatching in these works.
Do you actually pour the whole bucket on?
Yeah, or they're on the ground when I'm working them, and they're also hanging as well. When I get them off the ground, they get heavy, and I've got to fix up some armature which to do that. So it's always been a lot of physical effort in manufacturing these things. But I think that's the way, like see the beach, walk on the beach, image the beach. If you start to image the beach, it's certainly not down there, it's something else. That's what this is really, from floor to there. What is practical? Like if I don't want it all to fall off, run down, then it's got to be on the floor. If I want that kind of, which I did with that one, want that kind of immediacy of action, where it just happens, you let it take care of itself by throwing it onto the canvas. I did that vertically because I knew it would stick instantly, and I knew I could then get set to work on it with a hot air gun.
And do you still go to the beach?
I go every morning and buy the newspaper at the little cafe on the top of the cliff top, and I see it and I walk it often, but I don't do what I used to do, simply because I can't.
But it's still an inspiration.
Oh yeah. And every mark I make somehow lives within that experience.